The car sat half off the shoulder of Route 9, with its hazard lights blinking weakly into the November dark, and Gunnery Sergeant Nate Collier would have kept driving. He almost did. The truck cab was warm, the road ahead empty, and the cold outside pressed against the windows like something deliberate. But he had been raised a certain way by people who were no longer alive to remind him of it. And so he eased off the accelerator and let the pickup drift toward the gravel. Boone moved in the passenger seat beside him. Not much, just a shift of weight. Boone was a German shepherd, 4 years old, black and tan from the tip of his ears to the base of his thick tail, 82 pounds of quiet purpose, who had served 2 overseas deployments without complaint. He turned his wide amber eyes toward the car on the shoulder, and every muscle beneath his short coat went rigid. Nate felt it before he consciously registered it. That stillness, the kind that meant something specific. He had learned to trust it without asking questions first. And so, instead of pulling up close behind the stranded car, he stopped his truck 20 yards back, left the engine running, and looked. The car was a pale blue sedan, older model, no front-end damage, driver's side door closed. The hazards threw orange light across the shoulder grass in rhythmic pulses. Nothing moved inside, nothing moved outside. Boone did not relax. Nate sat with his hand resting on the door handle and did not move either. If this kind of story stays with you the way it stays with me, consider subscribing, turning on the bell, and watching until the very end. Some people wait a long time for someone to stop. This is about what happens when one finally does. He had been back in the States for 4 months. Not back home, because home was a complicated word for a man whose parents were both buried in Caldwell County and whose deployments had rearranged his understanding of stillness. He had taken a contract security job in Martinsburg and rented a room above a laundromat because it was cheap and because the noise of the dryers below at 2 in the morning was preferable to silence. He drove Route 9 every evening after his shift, not because it was efficient, but because the road ran through open country where he could see a long distance in every direction, which his nervous system still required. Boone rode with him always. That was the arrangement, informal and permanent, established the afternoon Nate had driven to the shelter in Winchester, on the suggestion of a woman at his VA appointment, who had said, without elaborating, that it sometimes helped. Boone had been at the end of a long kennel corridor. He had not barked, he had not jumped. He had pressed his broad forehead against the kennel door and looked at Nate with the patience of an animal trained to wait, without being trained to hope. Nate had stood there for almost a full minute. Then he said to the attendant, that one. He did not know yet what was wrong with the pale blue sedan. He knew what Boone knew, which was that something was. He put the truck in park, cracked his door, and listened. Wind through the grass, the tick of the hazard relay, then a sound he had not expected. A thin, high voice from inside the car, old and female and frightened. He could not make out the word at that distance. Then it came again, louder. Help. Nate got out of the truck. He left the door open. He told Boone stay, and Boone held his position in the passenger seat with his gaze fixed on the sedan and his ears rotating slightly, catching frequencies the human ear would miss. Nate walked toward the car with his hands visible at his sides and announced himself when he was 10 yards out. United States Marine Corps, just passing by, here to help. His voice was low and even, the voice he used in places where tone was the last thing you got wrong. The voice inside the car did not respond. Then the window came down 2 inches. That was enough. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, and she told him that in the first 30 seconds, not because he asked, but because she had been sitting alone in that car long enough to rehearse what she would say when someone finally stopped. She was a small woman, 73 years old, with the thinness of her shoulders visible beneath a gray wool coat that had seen better winters, white hair pinned back from a face that carried decades of outdoor work in its lines. Her hands were still on the steering wheel, with the controlled grip of someone managing their own composure. She had been a nurse for 31 years before she retired, and kept her cell phone charged as a professional habit, but there was no signal on this stretch of road. She had sat there for 1 hour and 14 minutes by the clock. Nobody had stopped. Nate asked if she was hurt. She said no, just cold. She said it the way her generation stated discomfort. Not a complaint, a fact. He asked if it was all right if he brought his dog near the vehicle. She looked at him through the gap with an expression that said, this was an odd thing to ask. Then something in her face shifted. She said, please. Boone came from the truck at a heel with no leash and stopped when Nate stopped. Evelyn Marsh looked at the dog through the window glass. Boone looked back at her. Then he sat down on the gravel beside the door, with the composed ease of an animal that had decided something without being asked. Not wariness, not aggression. The particular stillness of a dog that has made up its mind. Nate watched it happen and felt the pressure behind his sternum ease by 1 degree. He asked Evelyn to pop the hood. The problem was the serpentine belt, slipped from its track in the cold and stiff enough that the engine had quit rather than run rough. Nate had a basic toolkit behind his seat. He worked on the shoulder of Route 9 for 22 minutes, while Boone sat beside the driver door, and Evelyn stayed in the car with the window down 2 inches and asked him questions in a steady voice. Where was he from? What was the dog's name? Was he stationed nearby or just passing through? He answered in short sentences. He was from Caldwell County, originally. His dog was named Boone. He was between things, he said, which was the truest answer he had at the moment. When the engine turned over and held, Evelyn let out a breath that was not quite a sound and not quite a word. Nate came around to the driver window, wiping his hands on a shop rag from his coat pocket. He asked where she was headed. She said Sycamore Road, about 4 miles east. He said he would follow her. She said that was not necessary. He said he knew that. He followed her anyway. The 4 miles took 11 minutes and deposited them at a gravel lane, with a mailbox reading Mar in truck headlights, one of the S's missing. The lane ran through old oaks to a white clapboard farmhouse. 2 stories, a light burning in the front window, the kind of light that means someone is still awake and waiting. Evelyn got out moving slowly, favoring her left side in a way she probably thought was invisible. Nate got out too. Boone dropped from the cab beside him. A man came through the front door onto the porch before they were halfway up the walk. He was 6 feet tall and had once been 6'1". Harold Marsh was 77 years old, lean in the way of men who have worked with their hands their entire lives and never accumulated anything. Unnecessary. His hair was white and cut close. He stood in the porch light with a flannel shirt half-buttoned over a thermal undershirt and boots, pulled on hastily without being laced, and his face carried the expression of a man who has been sitting by a window for over an hour imagining the worst. He looked at his wife first, with the rapid checking look of a man whose love has always expressed itself as vigilance. Then he looked at Nate. Then he looked at Boone. Boone looked back at him with the calm amber attention he gave to all new people. Harold's shoulders came down a degree from where they had been. He said, "Come inside, both of you. It is too cold to stand here talking." The kitchen smelled of coffee and something roasted, a meal kept warm for hours, on the chance that Evelyn would come home for it. The table was set for 2. Harold went to the cabinet and added a 3rd cup without comment. They sat at the table, Harold and Evelyn, across from each other, with the wordless accounting of people who have been married, long enough to say everything important, without their mouths. Nate sat at the end with his hands around the cup. Boone settled near the back door, with his chin on his paws. The kitchen was modest and well kept, with photographs on the refrigerator accumulated over decades. Grandchildren in school portraits, a daughter in a wedding dress, a younger Harold and Evelyn standing before the same house with a barn behind them. Tools hung on pegboard near the back door. The counters were clean. It was the house of people who maintained things, not because anyone was watching, but because maintenance was a moral posture, a way of saying that what you had was worth keeping. Harold asked what had happened. Evelyn told it plainly, crediting the car in the cold rather than her own fear. Harold listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then looked at Nate and said, "She does not scare easily." Nate said he had gotten that impression. Harold said, "She never has, with the specific weight of a man making a statement that contains 40 years of history." Nate heard the weight of it and did not deflect it with a pleasantry. They drank coffee. Harold asked about rank, service, where he had been. The conversation moved the way these conversations move, between men of a certain formation. Not quickly, not with the anxious social energy of people who need to fill silence, but with the economy of men for whom careless words had once had consequences. Harold had served in the Army, infantry, 1970s. He said he had missed the worst of it by the time he was out, and said this, with the slight flattening that comes when a man discusses the thing he is grateful to have missed and ashamed, in some unexamined way, of having missed. Nate stayed an hour, which he had not planned. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was good, and Harold was asking questions with the directness of a man who was genuinely curious. And Boone had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor with his head between his paws. Boone did not sleep in unfamiliar places unless he had decided the place was safe. He had made this decision in under 20 minutes. When Nate stood to leave, Evelyn said he should come back for supper sometime if he found himself on Route 9 in the evenings. He said he might do that, noncommittally, in the voice he used, when he was not sure he meant something, but was not sure he did not. He drove back toward Martinsburg, with something in his chest that felt different from the way it usually felt on this stretch of road. He did not examine it. He did not want to examine it yet. He went back 4 days later. He told himself it was to check on the car. He turned onto the gravel lane in the early evening and found Harold in the barn, replacing the handle on an old draw knife, working with an unhurried rhythm that belonged to a man who had never learned to do anything sloppily. Harold looked up when Nate appeared in the doorway. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting someone and was willing to wait as long as necessary for that to happen. He said there was a barn door on the south stall that had been dragging since September and could use another set of hands if Nate had time. Nate said he had time. They worked until the sky went dark. Then Harold turned off the barn light and said supper was inside. Evelyn made pot roast. Nate said it was the best thing he had eaten in months, which was not a high bar, but which he meant entirely. Evelyn received the compliment with the slight pleased acknowledgement of a woman who knows she is a good cook and does not need effusive validation of the fact. After dinner, Nate and Harold sat on the porch in the cold and watched Boone move through the yard at the edge of the tree line with the happy authority of a dog who had decided that a piece of ground belonged to him. Harold watched the dog. He said, "That is a good animal." Nate said, "I know it." They were quiet. Then Harold said, "There is a section of fence on the east pasture that has been needing attention since the fall. Saturday, if you have it." That was how it started. Not with declarations. With a dragging door and a length of fence and the logic of a man showing up because he had been asked, and because it turned out he was built for it. The fence got repaired. The gutters on the south side came next, which Harold could no longer safely do from a ladder. After that, a water heater Nate diagnosed and fixed in 2 hours from things his father had taught him in a different kitchen 20 years ago. None of this was announced in advance. It accumulated the way necessary things accumulate between people who have found each other useful in the right ways and have the grace not to make too much of it. Evelyn baked on the days Nate came. A loaf of bread, a pie, once a batch of molasses cookies left on the counter without comment. He understood that this completed an exchange. She could not manage any other way because she was not a woman who accepted charity, and what he was offering could not be called charity if she had something to offer in return. Boone had appointed himself Evelyn's shadow on these visits, following her from room to room without invitation and without anxious neediness. He simply kept her in his line of sight. She moved through her own house with the particular ease of a woman quietly glad to be accompanied. She spoke to him in low, conversational sentences as she worked. He listened with his amber eyes on her face and adjusted the tilt of his head. This was enough. The problem arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of December. Nate was coming off his night shift when Harold called, and Harold's voice was a different thing than it had been in any of their previous conversations. Controlled, the way a man with military training controls his voice when something is wrong. But the control was doing visible work. He said Evelyn had had a fall. She had come down the porch steps in the early morning to get the newspaper, and the bottom step had given way where the wood had gone soft in the late season wet, and she had gone down hard on the walk. The emergency room had confirmed nothing was broken, but she had a badly bruised hip, and 2 days of observation recommended. Harold said she was in the hospital. He was calling from the waiting room. He said, "I am all right," before Nate could ask. Then he said, "I just thought you should know." Nate drove to the hospital. He stood at the entrance for a moment because he was aware that a German shepherd in a waiting room required a conversation he was not certain he wanted to have. Then he had the conversation, which took 3 minutes and involved a supervisor and the phrase service animal, which was not precisely accurate but was not precisely inaccurate either, and ended with Boone inside the building sitting quietly at heel, while Harold Marsh stood up from a plastic chair and crossed the room and shook. Nate, his hand with both of his. Harold's grip was firm, his eyes were dry. He said he appreciated Nate coming. Nate said he did not need to be appreciated for it. Harold held his hand a moment longer than necessary, then let go and sat back down. Nate sat beside him. Boone moved to Harold's other side and lay down on the waiting room floor with his shoulder against Harold's boot. Harold looked down at the dog. Something in his face softened in the particular way of men who are too old and too dignified to cry in public, but who are grateful for something to look at that allows them not to look at anything else. Evelyn came home 2 days later. The bruising was deep, and she moved with careful deliberateness for the following week. But she moved, and she declined to be treated as fragile by anyone, including Harold, who she managed with the patient firmness of a woman who had been doing it for 40 years. Nate replaced the bottom porch step the afternoon she came home while she was inside resting. He tore out the soft wood with a pry bar and cut a new section from pressure-treated lumber in the barn and set it and secured it and painted it with the exterior paint on the barn shelf. It took 1 hour. When Harold came out and saw the new step, he stood on it and tested it with his weight. He looked at Nate in the barn doorway. Harold said, "Thank you." Nate said, "It was the least." Harold said, "It was not the least." Nate went back to cleaning the brush. In the 2nd week of January, a vehicle appeared on Sycamore Road that had no business being there. It was a silver sedan, late model, clean in a way that announced it had not been driven down these roads before, parked at the mouth of a dirt track, 60 yards past the marsh lane where there was nothing to park for. Nate noticed it on a Tuesday evening, slowing as he passed. A man sat in the driver's seat, looking at his phone. Mid-40s, dark overcoat, the kind of groomed and assembled look that belonged to an office building rather than a county road in January. He did not look up as Nate passed. Boone tracked the silver sedan from the passenger window with a rigid, forward-facing attention that Nate recognized and did not like. He drove to the Marsh farm and said nothing about the car. He noted it. He noted the time and the direction it faced, which was toward the Marsh mailbox. He saw it again on Thursday. Same spot, late afternoon. The man was outside the vehicle this time, standing by the door with his phone to his ear, his back to the road, well shod. The posture that comes from years of meetings with people who defer to you. Boone tracked him through the window without making a sound. Nate drove to the Marsh house and found Harold on the porch and asked him carefully, and without making it large, if anyone had been by lately about the property. Harold set his coffee cup down on the porch rail. His face changed by a degree. A man had come to the door. About 10 days ago, he said. A representative from a company called Meridian Land Partners. They were interested in purchasing agricultural land in the county for a conservation easement program. He had been very polished and friendly and had left a business card and said there was no pressure. Harold said the man had smiled the whole time he was talking. He said he had a smile that worked very hard, and Boone had not left Evelyn's side the entire time the man was at the door. Harold stated this last detail as if it were simply a fact and not, as Nate heard it, a verdict. Nate took the business card and spent the following 2 evenings doing the kind of research that requires nothing except a laptop and patience and the willingness to follow one documented fact to the next. Meridian Land Partners was registered in Delaware. 4 years old, its registered agent, a law firm in Northern Virginia. Its website was professional and vague, full of language about conservation and rural American heritage. None of that was necessarily sinister. What was worth noting was the pattern that emerged when he searched the company name alongside county recorder databases in 3 neighboring counties. 3 separate land purchases in the previous 18 months, each a farm in financial distress, each sold below market value, each resold within 14 months to a different entity, at a premium of between 30 and 60%. The sellers in each case were older couples. Nate sat with the laptop past midnight. Then he called Dale Whitfield, who had been a county assessor in Caldwell before he retired, and who knew things about land transfers and corporate holding structures, because he had spent 30 years paying attention to them. It was late. Dale Whitfield answered on the second ring. He said, "That is not a conservation easement program." He said it in the tone of a man who has heard this particular language before and knows exactly what it is covering. Nate returned to the Marsh farm the following Saturday with what he had found, organized on 3 printed pages. He told Harold and Evelyn at the kitchen table, with the pages flat on the oilcloth between them. He did not dramatize it. He described what Meridian Land Partners appeared to be doing. The pattern of distressed farm acquisitions. The quick resale at significant markup, the way the conservation language gave the initial approach a legitimacy. The subsequent transactions did not support. He told them what Dale Whitfield had said. He told them that no one could be compelled to sell their land, and that, if they had signed nothing, they had nothing to worry about legally. They had signed nothing. Evelyn said this firmly. Harold said, "We were not born yesterday. Without heat, but with the dignity of a man aware that being elderly makes certain people believe you are less than you are. Nate said, I know you were not. Harold studied the documents for a moment, then said, how worried should we be? Nate said he would tell them exactly how worried after he made one more call. That call was to Renata Voss, a deputy with the county sheriff's office he had met 6 weeks earlier at a VA community event. She was 38, dark-haired, direct-eyed, with the economic body language of someone who had been in law enforcement long enough to shed all its unnecessary ceremonies. She had given him her card, not because he asked, but because she had made a professional assessment. He called on a Sunday morning and laid out what he had found in the same organized way. He had presented it to Harold and Evelyn. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said she knew the name Meridian Land Partners because a similar complaint had come across her desk 3 months ago from a family in the western part of the county. She said the pattern was consistent with the one she had been building a file on. She asked if he could share the documented research. He said he could. She said she would like to speak with Harold and Evelyn at their convenience. She said it would be entirely voluntary and confidential. He said he would ask them. He drove to the farm that afternoon. Harold said, what time does she want to come? Renata Voss came to the Marsh farm on a Wednesday, wearing civilian clothes, because she had correctly understood that a uniform would introduce a formality that was not needed here. She was there for an hour and a half, sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, asking questions with a precision and patience that Nate recognized as genuine investigative training. She asked Harold to describe the Meridian man in physical detail. She asked Evelyn about the exact language he had used. She asked if they knew of neighbors who had been similarly approached. Harold named 2 families on the road, the Glens about a mile east and the Carvers south of the creek. After Renata left, Harold stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets. Then he said, I am going to call Earl Glenn in the morning. Nate said that would be useful. Harold said he has a daughter who is a paralegal in Hagerstown. That landed harder than Nate expected, not because it was surprising, but because it was the moment. Harold Marsh stopped being someone who needed help and became someone who was helping. That was a different thing entirely. The Meridian representative came back on a Thursday morning in late January, when Nate was in the barn repairing a stall hinge. He heard the car on the gravel before Boone reacted. But Boone reacted first, not with a sound, with a full body stiffening, ears peaked, chin coming up from the workshop table where he had been resting, amber eyes going to the barn door with the particular locked intensity that meant he had heard something the way he heard certain things, not merely with his ears, but with some instrument more finely calibrated than hearing. The man came around the corner of the barn with his hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat and his practiced smile already in place. The smile of a man who has entered 1,000 rooms and knows the smile is the first price of admission. His name was Gregory Talley. He said good morning. He said he was there to follow up with the Marshes about the conservation program. He said it with the confidence of someone who had not yet encountered anything in this county that pleasantness could not handle. Boone stood. He did not growl. He did not advance. He stood with his amber eyes on Gregory Talley and his body perfectly still in the way that is more precise than a growl. The way that says, I have already assessed you, and I am not confused about what I am looking at. Talley's smile held, but his eyes changed the tell. He looked at Nate and said, is this a good time? Nate said it depended on what he was there for. Talley said he had explained that. Nate said Harold and Evelyn Marsh were not interested in selling their property. Talley said he respected that. and simply wanted to ensure they had full information before making a decision. Nate said they had full information. He said it in the particular quiet voice he used when he had already considered all available options and had decided on the one he was using. Tally looked at him with an expression that was working to remain pleasant and finding it slightly effortful. He said he would leave another card. Nate said there was no need. There was a pause of 4 seconds. Then Tally said, "All right," and turned and walked back around the barn. Nate listened to the car start and the gravel shift and the car back out of the lane. Then Boone sat down, his posture eased by a degree. The controlled decompression of an animal that has been at readiness and is now at rest. Nate told Harold that evening. Harold listened with his arms folded and his jaw working slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is processing. Something that requires control, anger. When Nate finished, Harold said, "He will try again." Nate said, "He will try." Harold said, "What do we do?" Nate described the trail cameras, the kind sold in every farm and outdoor store in the county, positioned at the mouth of the lane and along the fence line facing the road, time-stamped footage that would document any return. Harold said he had one in the barn from the previous fall. Nate ordered 2 more from a hardware store in town. He installed all 3 with Harold holding the flashlight, while the temperature hovered in the low 20s, their breath hanging in the air between them. Harold tested the view on his phone and said, "That is something." He said it with quiet satisfaction. Renata Voss called 10 days later. She said the file on Meridian Land Partners was building, that a title company in the county had flagged 2 inquiries the company had made about properties with tax liens, consistent with targeting financially vulnerable owners. She said Earl Glenn and his daughter had agreed to provide statements about an approach they had received the previous fall. She said she was coordinating with the county attorney's office. Gregory Tally did not appear again on Sycamore Road. In the last week of January, on a night when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees and the oaks along the lane cracked like rifle shots, the camera facing the road recorded a silver sedan idling in front of the marsh lane at 2:17 in the morning for 4 minutes before driving on. The timestamp was precise in the lower corner of the frame. Harold showed it to Nate at the kitchen table. Evelyn looked at the footage and set her coffee cup down and folded her hands. She said, "He is trying to decide whether we can be frightened." Harold looked at Nate and said, "Can we send this to your deputy?" Nate said, "We can send it right now." Renata Voss responded within 20 minutes. She had what she needed to open a formal harassment and trespass investigation. Within the following 2 weeks, the shape of the thing became clearer. Gregory Tally was identified as an agent of record for Meridian Land Partners and as a principal in a related entity that had participated in 4 of the flip transactions Nate had documented. The county attorney filed a complaint with the Delaware Secretary of State. The title company cooperated. Dale Whitfield provided a written statement. 2 of the 3 families who had sold land under high-pressure conditions engaged an attorney. Meridian's website went quiet in mid-February, the contact page returning an error. Renata Voss told Nate the investigation was ongoing and that she could not share specifics, but that the right people were paying attention. He thanked her, she said. Thanked the Marshes. They were the ones who did not flinch. He told them that evening at the kitchen table with supper on the stove, and Boone under the table at Evelyn's feet. Harold listened until he had the full picture. When Nate was done, Harold said, "Good." He said it with the simple finality of a man who has seen things resolved he did not expect to see resolved, and who does not need to add anything to the fact of it. He had not thought about the laundromat room in Martinsburg For 10 days, when he finally noticed, he was not thinking about it. He had been spending evenings at the Marsh farm without calculation, arriving after his shift ended, and staying through the morning, helping with whatever Harold needed. One morning, he was in the barn cutting kindling with Boone, asleep near the old space heater, and Evelyn appeared in the barn door in her coat with 2 cups of coffee. She crossed the barn and held out the cup, and he took it, and they stood there in the morning cold and drank without speaking for a while. Then she said, "You know, Harold is not going to ask you." He said, "Ask me what?" She said to stay. She said he was too proud to ask, and too aware of what the asking would mean to do it right. She said, "I am telling you so. You do not mistake his silence." She looked at him with the clear-eyed directness of a woman who has spent decades reading people. "Correctly," she said. "You are already here, Nate. You have been here since November." He did not answer. The pressure in his chest tightened unexpectedly, not painfully, in the way of something that has been compressed for a long time and has found space where it is allowed to expand. He gave notice at the laundromat room. At the end of February, he did not tell Harold or Evelyn he was doing it. He moved his things, which were not many, into the spare room on the 2nd floor on a Saturday morning while they were at church, so that when they came back, there was nothing to discuss except that he was there. Harold came into the spare room and looked at the bag on the bed and the toolkit on the dresser and the dog bed in the corner where Boone was already installed. Harold looked at the dog bed for a moment. Then he looked at Nate. He said, "Supper is at 6. He said it without inflection, the way a man states a fact. Then he walked back downstairs. Nate put his hand on Boone's head, and Boone's tail moved once, the slow, confident arc of an animal that has never been confused about where home was. He stood at the window of the spare room and looked out at the oaks along the lane and the gray February sky above them, and the frost still thick on the east pasture, where he and Harold had repaired the fence together 4 months ago. By March, the investigation had produced its first formal results: a cease and desist order from the Delaware Secretary of State, a civil complaint filed by 2 of the selling families, and a referral to the State Attorney General for review of potential elder financial exploitation statutes. Spring came slowly to Sycamore Road, the way it comes to cold country, not all at once, but in layered concessions, frost softening in the mornings, then mud, then the first green showing in the east pasture at the repaired fence line. Harold talked about putting a small herd of cattle back on the pasture in the fall, the first time in 7 years. He did not say whether he was asking Nate's opinion or stating his own. Nate said the fencing was solid and the pasture would support it. Harold said, "That is what I thought too." The barn roof section had been repaired and painted. The stall that had leaked was dry. Boone had learned the full perimeter of the property over the winter and moved through it with proprietary ease, checking the fence line in the mornings with Harold, and settling in the barn in the afternoons, and coming inside in the evenings to take up his position near Evelyn's chair. His vigilance had not diminished. He was not a dog that misplaced vigilance, but the quality of it had changed. The way vigilance changes when it is no longer braced against absence, but becomes the natural expression of an animal attending to what it loves. One evening in April, when the kitchen window was open for the first time, and the smell of the warming pasture came through it, Harold said after supper that there was something he wanted to say. He set down his fork. He said, "You came down that road on a November night and stopped your truck for a woman. You did not know, because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Nobody made you do any of the rest of it," he said. "Your father raised a man worth knowing, Nate." He said it clearly and without decoration, with the weight of a man who had thought about it for months and decided It needed to be said plainly, rather than not at all. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a barn swallow went across the window in the last of the April light. Nate looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Harold. He said, "Your daughter told me to take things well." Harold said, "Carol is a smart woman." There was a pause. Then Nate said, "I know what my father would say about the two of you." Harold said, "What would he say?" Nate said, "He would say you are the right kind of people." Harold looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "That is mutual." After supper, they sat on the porch in the April evening, Harold and Nate in the two porch chairs. With the sound of the spring frogs, starting up in the low ground east of the barn, the lane oaks had their first leaves, small and pale against the darkening sky. Boone lay between them on the porch boards, with his head on his paws, his amber eyes half closed in the particular relaxed alertness of a dog who is watching things he does not expect to be threats. Evelyn came out after a while with her coffee and stood at the porch rail, looking out at the pasture where the last light was still on the grass. She said, "You remember last November," he said he did. She said, "I had been sitting in that car for over an hour and nobody had stopped. Nobody at all." She said it without accusation. She said, "And then you did." She said it the way she stated important things, as a fact that did not require amplification. Nate looked at Boone for a moment. He said, "It was not really me." He said, "He would not let me drive past." She looked at the dog. Boone's tail moved once against the porch boards. She said, "I know." She said, "I knew that when he sat down beside my door." She said, "A dog like that does not choose wrong." The frogs kept on in the low ground. The light left the pasture, and the kitchen window behind them glowed warm against the cooling air. Harold refilled the cups. Nate sat with his back against the porch post and looked out at the lane and the oaks and the wide spring sky beyond them, and understood that this was what had been waiting at the end of the long road he had been unable to stop traveling. Not a destination he had mapped, a place that had chosen him the same night he had chosen to stop. There are people in this world who are sitting somewhere alone, running low on what they came with, waiting for someone to notice them. Not loudly, not with desperation, just waiting, with the patience of people who have survived long enough to know that sometimes the thing you need most arrives in the dark on a cold road when you least expect it. Maybe you have been that person. Maybe you know someone who is. What Nate Collier found on Route 9 in November was not a lesson he could have learned any other way. He learned it by stopping, when stopping was inconvenient, by following when the road ahead was already clear, by showing up not once but again and again until showing up became the name of where he lived. Boone knew first. The best ones always do. They do not wait for the evidence to be perfect. They act on what they have. May you have that kind of clarity when the moment asks for it. May you have the courage to stop. May God bless you and keep you and bring you in His time to exactly the place where you belong.